She put it in her dating profile, plain as a grocery list. Looking for something serious, marriage-minded, not interested in wasting anyone's time, including mine. No games, no mystery. And somehow, that honesty felt more terrifying to type than anything she'd ever said to a therapist. Why does saying exactly what you want out loud feel more dangerous than staying quiet and getting hurt anyway? If you've ever softened what you actually wanted in a relationship, downgraded, "I want commitment," to, "I'm just seeing where things go," because it felt safer to say, you already know this feeling. There's a name for what's happening when someone finally stops doing that. It's called loud looking, and it's quietly become one of the most talked about shifts in modern dating psychology. Most people think loud looking is just bluntness. It isn't. It's something closer to an act of psychological courage, and most people get the mechanics of why completely backwards. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly what's happening in the brain when a woman finally says what she wants out loud, why it takes real nerve to do it, and how that honesty ends up protecting her far more than staying quiet ever did. This isn't a video telling you to be blunt for bluntness' sake. It's about understanding why the specific act of naming your intentions clearly functions, less like a personality trait and more like a psychological tool, one that does something staying vague simply cannot do. And if you've ever wondered why this particular shift in dating culture is happening now, at scale, among women specifically, the answer isn't fashion. It's fatigue. A collective, quiet exhaustion with a strategy that was supposed to protect people from heartbreak and instead just delayed it. Because the real reason this is spreading isn't trend chasing. It's self-preservation, and the psychology behind it is more interesting than you'd expect. Picture a composite case, built from patterns seen again and again in relationship psychology. We'll call her Priya. For years, Priya's dating strategy was a quiet one. Stay vague, stay easygoing, let the relationship define itself organically. She told herself this was open-mindedness. It wasn't. It was armor. If she never said what she wanted out loud, she could never be told, directly, that she wasn't going to get it. She could point to the evidence too. 3 different relationships, each one lasting 8 or 9 months, each one ending the same way, a slow fade, a mutual, we want different things, and a private, nagging suspicion that she's known that from month 2, but hadn't wanted to be the one to say it first. The pattern wasn't bad luck. It was the predictable output of a strategy built to delay information rather than gather it. Here's what almost nobody names clearly. Staying vague isn't neutral. It's a protective strategy, and like most protective strategies, it comes from somewhere specific. Many women learn early, through dating, through culture, sometimes through one bad experience that gets generalized into a rule, that wanting too much, too clearly, gets you labeled needy, intense, too much, too soon. So the mind makes a quiet trade, shrink the want down to something unfalsifiable, and you can never be rejected for having it, because you never technically said it. But that's only half the story, because vagueness doesn't just protect against rejection. It also protects against something psychologists know is far more distressing. Prolonged uncertainty. Staying deliberately unclear about what you want keeps a relationship in an undefined state. And undefined states are, ironically, easier for an anxious mind to tolerate short-term than a direct answer might be. A clear no closes a door. A vague, we'll see, keeps it technically open, even when it's really just closed and unlabeled. Here's where it gets uncomfortable. That short-term relief comes at a long-term cost. Every month spent in a relationship that was never clearly defined is a month spent extending an investment, based on hope rather than evidence. A pattern psychologists recognize as the sunk cost fallacy, quietly operating in a romantic context. The vaguer the terms, the longer the investment can be justified, because there was never a clear moment where the terms failed to be met. There's a deeper layer underneath even that, and it reaches back to attachment theory. For someone with an anxious attachment style, ambiguity can feel almost soothing in the moment, because it postpones the possibility of a definitive no, the thing that attachment anxiety fears most. But that soothing is a trap. It trades a single clean moment of pain now for a long, low-grade drip of uncertainty later. And drip-fed uncertainty, as it turns out, is measurably harder on the nervous system over time than one sharp, resolved answer. And underneath all of it sits a cultural layer that makes this even harder to unlearn. Women, more than men on average, have historically been socially rewarded for being easy to be around and quietly penalized for being too direct, a double standard that has nothing to do with whether directness is actually effective, and everything to do with which behaviors got labeled likable in the first place. So loud-looking isn't just a dating strategy. For a lot of women, it's a direct act of pushing back against a lifetime of being taught that clarity is somehow impolite. Here's the deeper truth underneath all of it. Loud-looking isn't recklessness. It's a deliberate trade of one kind of pain for a far less costly one. Think of it like this. Imagine two ways to find out if a bridge can hold your weight. One way is to walk across slowly, testing each board with your full weight, risking a long fall if it breaks halfway across. The other is to test the very first board immediately, and if it cracks, you find out standing safely on solid ground. Staying vague is the slow walk across the whole bridge. Loud-looking is testing the first board on purpose, right at the start, while you're still standing somewhere safe. This is why stating your intentions clearly isn't the risky move it feels like. It's actually the risk-reducing one. When you say plainly what you're looking for, you're not inviting more rejection into your life. You're front-loading the filtering process that would have happened anyway, just later, more expensively, and after you were already emotionally invested. A person who disappears the moment you say, "I want something serious," was never going to stay once you found out 3 months in. You didn't lose him. You found out early, on solid ground, instead of finding out later, mid-fall. Notice what this reframe actually does. It takes an outcome that used to feel like proof of your own unworthiness, someone leaving, and relocates it to where it actually belongs, which is simply information about timing and compatibility. The board cracked. That was always going to happen at some point on this bridge. Loud-looking just moves the crack to the beginning, where falling costs you almost nothing, instead of the middle, where it costs you months. This is also what actually happening neurologically when loud-looking feels so uncomfortable to practice. Your brain is running an old threat detection program that equates clarity with exposure and exposure with danger. But that program was built for a context where being direct about your needs really could cost you social standing. It wasn't built for adult dating, where the entire point is compatibility, and compatibility can't be assessed accurately if one party is negotiating from behind a fog. There's one more piece worth naming, because it's the part that finally makes the discomfort make sense. The fear you feel before saying what you want isn't a signal to stop. It's simply what it feels like when an old, well-worn strategy is being retired in real time. Vagueness kept you safe from a very specific kind of pain for a long time. The pain of a clear no. Retiring that strategy doesn't feel like relief at first. It feels like removing a splint from a limb that's been braced so long, it forgot it could move freely on its own. So how do you actually start practicing loud-looking, especially if it makes your stomach drop just thinking about it? First, separate stating a want from demanding a guarantee. Loud-looking isn't, "You have to give me this." It's, "This is what I'm looking for. Let's both find out quickly if that's a match." That distinction matters, because most of the fear around being direct comes from confusing a clear statement with an ultimatum. One invites information, the other invites conflict. You're only doing the first one. Second, practice with low-stakes clarity before high-stakes clarity. If naming "I want marriage" on a first date feels like too much too soon, start smaller. State a scheduling preference plainly instead of vaguely. Tell a date directly that you had a good time instead of playing it cool. Every small rep of saying the true thing instead of the safe thing teaches your nervous system that clarity doesn't end in disaster. Third, reframe an early exit as information, not injury. When someone leaves the moment you're clear about what you want, that's not proof your want was wrong. It's proof of a mismatch that was always there, now simply visible instead of hidden. The mismatch didn't get created by your honesty. It just stopped being invisible. Fourth, notice who stays. This is the part loud-looking is actually optimizing for. The people who don't flinch at clarity, who meet it with their own clarity instead of vague deflection, are self-selecting into your life as people capable of exactly the kind of direct communication a real relationship eventually requires anyway. You're not just filtering out mismatches, you're actively building a short list of people who've already proven they can handle honesty, which is a far better predictor of relationship success than chemistry alone. Fifth, and maybe most important, let being direct be an act of self-respect, rather than a bid for approval. You're not saying what you want so someone will agree to give it to you. You're saying it because it's true, and because a life spent managing other people's comfort at the expense of your own clarity is not, in the end, a peaceful life. It's just a quiet one. And there's a sixth point worth naming, because it addresses the objection that usually comes up right about now. What if being this direct scares away someone who actually would have been right for you, given time? Here's the honest answer. If a person needed months of ambiguity to warm up to something you already knew you wanted, the timeline was never really the obstacle. Their willingness was. Loud looking doesn't rush anyone into a decision they weren't going to reach anyway. It just moves the moment of finding that out closer to the beginning, where it costs you far less. None of this guarantees an easier dating life overnight. What it guarantees is a more honest one, and an honest search, even when it's slower, ends somewhere real instead of somewhere convenient. It also compounds. Every time you practice saying the true thing instead of the safe thing and survive it, the next true thing gets a little easier to say, until clarity stops being a performance of courage and simply becomes how you naturally show up. You were never too much for knowing what you want. You were simply the first one in the conversation willing to say it out loud. If this gave language to something you've been quietly practicing or quietly avoiding, tell me in the comments, what's one thing you've never said out loud on a first date, but wish you had? And if you want next week's video to break down exactly how to say it without sounding like a checklist, subscribe, because that's exactly what's coming next.